Joy Drive with Dee and Warren on this very special World AIDS Day commemoration episode. And The Band Played On is a film made in 1993. It was homework from Susie Wrong. It's a docudrama based on the best-selling 1987 non-fiction book And the Band Played On, Politics, People and the AIDS Epidemic. The book was written by Randy Shilts. The cast is extraordinary, including highlights a very young and hot Matthew Modine and my absolute favourite Lily Tomlin. To tell us all about it is our Joy Drive favourite Susie Wrong.
Susie Wrong, Joy Drive with Dee and Warren's film, TV and theatre reviewer.
Susie, welcome back to Joy Drive.
Thank you.
Hey, Susie.
And The Band Played On from 1993. It was, I think, the first sort of mainstream big movie about the AIDS epidemic. It follows the adventures of Don Francis, an American epidemiologist who was with the Centers for Disease Control. And we follow the early developments from 1981, basically 1981 to 83 or 4, I think, mostly. And we watch the world through his eyes and see how government and other medical establishments were kind of letting us down because they were keeping a lot of information away from us and all that.
It's interesting to watch that all those clever minds working in the lab, they all seemed kind of on the same page, but then as soon as politics gets involved and funding of medical institutions and ownership of the knowledge and presumably in time the vaccine, once that all comes into play, it stuffs up bad.
And I think that's where I got disappointed with the scientists. There was a little prestige to be gained in studying something that affected homosexuals at the time, and I thought, that's not following the principles of science, is it?
But a lot of the scientists in the lab, don't you agree, Susie, seem to be portrayed very positively. The people that weren't portrayed positively were the patients. I thought there was no positive gay man in that show.
Oh, that's interesting. I think it came from a time... Well, this film came out about 2 months before Philadelphia, so it was like 10 years after the AIDS hit the world. So we've had 10 years for the epidemic to unfold, and things were getting very bad. In 93, things were not better at all. And I think both films were dealing a little bit with the sort of antipathy that society had. I keep thinking about how it's so different from where we are today. When the COVID-19 happened, COVID-19 happened early in the year, and people were saying the vaccine would be discovered in a year's time. I kept thinking, they haven't found a vaccine for HIV for decades, that kind of optimism.
Warren and I were just talking about that. We're just saying it's extraordinary. I'm not sure what it's like in New South Wales where you're based, but here in Victoria, every single day the Premier stands up and tells us exactly how many people are infected and have died. I guess that's a national thing. Imagine if that had happened back in 84. Imagine if the Premier had stood up and said, 87 of our boys were infected today, and this is how many have died. It just would have... the numbers were extraordinary.
And I think also it was 5 years that passed before institutions like public health and government and also research and media got on board with the virus. And if you look at President Reagan as well, completely ignored all the pleas from the scientists at the time, cuts the funding, and then sends out his agency people to mislead them and say, oh, no, your funding hasn't been cut. It was just 5 years of wasted time.
Yeah, so it's taken less than a year for something really, really wonderful to happen for COVID-19, but it's been 3 decades for HIV, and we still haven't got a cure, we haven't got a vaccine.
Well, we're talking.
Unfortunately, we've got PrEP. I think which is something that we need to draw attention.
I think a vaccine is absolutely what we need to be working towards. Susie Wrong, you famously were living in Singapore in the, hard to believe, but in the 80s, I guess you were living there. Do you recall, what was Singapore's response like?
I was a little bit young. So in 83, I was 10 years old. So around that time, I was, still very, very young. I did hear from sort of foreign media, because sometimes we had things like American 60 Minutes on our TV, because that was considered quite a highbrow program. So some information did leak through, and I did get information about that about AIDS being sort of a gay-related disease. But in Singapore, from my memory, it was touted as just a very infectious sexual disease. And in a way, it was good. You know, it kind of protected women and married families everywhere, instead of sort of focusing just on the gays. But I look back and I noticed how it was so hard for them to acknowledge that gay people existed in the country that HIV became just another STI almost. Well, very severe STI.
Which might have actually been a good thing in terms of the existent gay population of Singapore, which was very underground, I imagine, and it still largely is, but certainly then it would have, because you're not allowed to be gay, I guess they can't promote something as a gay disease.
It is sort of the opposite of what happened with Reagan. You know, Reagan sort of swept it under the carpet because they kept thinking of it as the gays, and, you know, we can sacrifice the gays. But in Singapore, it wasn't that at all. It was just something that everyone had to be very careful. I think, you know, I think people were afraid of prostitutes more than anything. So, you know, and sort of that coming into all the families in Singapore. So in a way, people were protected very well, just as they have been with COVID-19. It's such a small place. So I guess it always feels like it's much easier to control. But, you know, I also remember it came at a time when the gay movement was happening everywhere. You know, it's many years after Stonewall. So gay people in the West were trying very hard to come out and sort of bring activism everywhere. And AIDS made it hard, I guess, because the stigma just kept piling on, didn't it? Because at first you were just sinners, and now you were not just sinners, but you were also sort of spreading diseases.
We're speaking with Susie Rong, who's Joy Drive's absolute favourite theatre film TV critic and reviewer. Susie Rong, the movie and the band played on illustrates just how far storytelling in movies has come. It has dated so terribly badly, I think. Maybe not politically, perhaps, but certainly in terms of storytelling. Just as a movie, aside from the topic, how do you find it?
I watched and the band played on. It's much less emotional than I had remembered, because back in the day, everything was just so harrowing. All those images of people and their lesions, they were so terrifying, and I never was able to revisit these movies until now. But in comparison with more recent things like Holding the Man and The Normal Heart, which are much more dramatic, which are much more emotional, I think those films, more recent films, allow us to be much more cathartic. With those films, we're able to sort of go into the drama, go into the emotions a bit more, where these old ones, I think, it felt like there was a distance necessary for us to sort of cope with the trauma that was ongoing. Yeah. I felt that, and the band played on particularly was quite clinical in its approach. While watching it this day, I felt like quite clinical in the approach, but I remember quite clearly back in the day it was just harrowing, just seeing anything remotely close to reality, which it tried to portray with a lot of the patients. That was really scary at that time.
Yeah, Susie, I had a similar experience watching this. I found that it wasn't as upsetting as, say, watching something like Holding the Man or Philadelphia, but it did trigger my anger a lot. I found that was happening as I was watching the film, because of the time lost that we spoke about before, but also, let's be honest, the gay community were difficult at first as well. When there were attempts made to try and modify the sexual behaviour, they were accused of being sexual fascists, and there were delays there as well in accepting that this was affecting the gay community at the time.
Well, they were holding information away from the gay community. They weren't able to give the gay community sort of definitive answers about how it was transmitted. So, obviously coming out from the 60s to 70s, all the gays were thinking about were straight people trying to push people back to the closet and trying to shut down the community again. I think that was how it perceived, and we can see that. And, a lot of the responsibilities had to be laid with the medical professionals who weren't able to sort of give us definitive answers about this, that it was transmitted through semen and the fluids, So that was held from, I think it looks like, for a couple of years. So it just, for the longest time, it just felt like they were trying to push gays back into the closet.
So in terms of, let's try and pick the the movie that contains the subject of HIV and AIDS that best depicts the nature of the situation. I'm going Philadelphia. That was a very moving and I just think beautiful film. Won Tom Hanks the best actor, I think. Did he get the Oscar for that?
Yes, it.
And Denzel. I mean, I could watch him doing anything.
I'm agreeing with you, Dee. Philadelphia for me.
Philadelphia. Susie?
I would say The Normal Heart.
Now, this I have not seen.
Yeah, it's 2015 or something. It's quite recent, but it's about those early days, but it's made because it's made so recent. We are able to sort of have that distance and sort of look back with a bit more bravery. And I think there's a lot more. The emotions are richer, and I think looking back, maybe somehow you get sort of more reality, more truth, in fact, with time.
I know that all these films can't cover everything, and absolutely the focus of the AIDS epidemic, certainly in these more historical films, has got to be the gay men who were like overwhelmingly suffered from this. But there's sort of an erasure of the lesbian community in this, in that I know a lot of older lesbians that devoted much of their lives to caring for gay men with this disease, and you don't see a lot of it referred to. And I know it's absolutely not a slight at the gay men who were dealing with so much more, but lesbian women played a massive role in the care of gay men, I feel.
I agree. I worked with a lot of lesbians who were 100% devoted to helping people who were struggling with HIV.
Yeah. So
yeah, and also the racial dimension of it, because I'm looking through these lists of HIV films, AIDS films, and they're all about white men.
Yes.
So there's something there that informs the way we think about our movement and our community, actually.
And that was the other thing I wanted to ask you. There was one Asian character in the film last night that I watched, and the band played on. Was he supposed to have infected the older partner? Is that the assertion?
I was confused too. I don't know what they were trying to say.
Yeah, I think he was saying, I've got another lover, and he went away, and then when he came back, when he realised the older man had been infected, I think he was saying, I did that.
The remarkable thing is that actor, B.D. Wong, appeared 22 years later in The Normal Heart.
Oh, really?
He did.
Well, he's cute as a button.
Yeah. It's wonderful.
Oh, very good. I loved watching it just because it's a good time to remember all the issues that were happening then. I didn't like it as a film. I didn't like the storytelling method. I thought it was too confusing. Just to have Lily Tomlin back on the screen back in the 80s was fantastic. It's just such a great... Phil Collins, I did not realise that was him. But just to have a great comedic actor playing a dead straight role, and... Well, I guess to that end, she was showing the lesbians supporting the community. So, maybe there's that.
Yeah, it's worth it.
There is a lot of that kind of erasure in Hollywood filmmaking, definitely.
Yeah.
If you want to go and see it, you can see it on Binge at the moment, or on YouTube. I think it's available as well.
I have so much to say about next week's show, but we have to wait for next week. If you haven't seen it, tell them what it is, Susie, and where to catch it.
Happier Season. The Christmas rom-com starring Kristen Stewart. You can see that at the cinemas.
Yep. And we'll talk especially about the portrayal of a lesbian character by a straight woman next week. Thanks, Susie Wrong.
Thanks, Susie Wrong. We'll take it out.